61% of Albertans oppose subsidies for a new pipeline, according to Probe Research, and two-thirds say the province's economy is too dependent on oil and gas. Meanwhile, according to Abacus data, 69% of people across Canada and 62% in Alberta support government regulations to limit oil and gas companies' greenhouse gas emissions. Albertans and other Canadians alike also wanted stronger industrial carbon pricing. There are multiple polls that show this from different polling firms, including showing that Albertans are against subsidies for this pipeline. Again, multiple different polls. Cuts to climate policy and the construction of a new pipeline are not necessary for national unity, and these actions only enable a small group of oil, gas, and tech interests who want to keep pushing for more division and leverage, and have just learned that pushing for division and leverage works. The Pembina Institute points out, to quote, Alberta and Ottawa said any new pipeline would be privately funded. That promise was broken. A private company will cover just 10%. Taxpayers will front up tens of billions of dollars.
So here we are talking about building a pipeline to a market, which the market itself says, no, we don't want your stuff.
Sure.
They say, when you go over there, they say, oh yeah, right now we could use, 200,000 barrels a day for this petrochemical plant because, there's the international heavy market is tight. But that doesn't mean if you're going to build a 50-year piece of infrastructure, which the taxpayer will inevitably help fund, what they need today is not adequate. You need to know or have a pretty good guess that they're going to need that same amount of oil in 25 years and that you can provide it competitively. And nobody ever asked that question. Not the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, not his Energy Minister, Tim Hodgson, not Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, and not any of the oil CEOs. They assume it to be true. And assuming is not good enough when taxpayers' dollars are on the line. I have a mole, as journalists are wont to do, in NRCan, and they tell me that inside the department, those conversations are verboten.
You don't discuss
the government. The government is committed to oil and LNG and pipelines.
Yep.
And you best not, if you want your keep your job and keep your career on track, you best not contradict what the minister wants. And I want to circle back to this, the values Carney versus Goldman Sachs Carney. Tim Hodgson is a former Goldman Sachs banker. Mm-hmm. He worked with Carney at Goldman Sachs. When Carney went over from Goldman Sachs to the Bank of Canada, he followed him as his deputy. And then his Hodgson's reputation is he's a deal bulldog. He's a deal maker, man. I mean, if you want to get a deal for a pipeline or whatever it is, he puts it together, he gets the capital, he'll make it happen. And it's no secret, it is no, to me anyway, why Carney chose him as the Minister for Natural Resources. It's to do deals. It's to get all of these big projects that are going into the major projects office and to get them funded and to get them up and running as quickly as possible and bring them across the finish line. That's Tim Hodgson's job. It's not Tim Hodgson's job to be thoughtful. It's not Tim Hodgson's job to think about the energy transition and where the global energy system is going and how demand is changing in Asia and how it's probably going to change pretty quickly. That's not his job. He's a deal maker and he's got his blinkers on and that's all he's doing. So it falls to people like, it falls to Energy Media and a few others to basically try to build educate the Canadians about it and build a political constituency for change.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Director of Communications with Sierra Club Canada. And today we're going to be talking first about the announcement of a plan by the federal government to publicly build a pipeline, as opposed to, building something like housing or renewable energy. That happened yesterday on July 2nd, 2026, and all the problems with it. And then we will have an interview with Markham Hislop of Energi Media, that's Energy with an I on the end. That's actually from April 2026. So a couple of months old, but it gets into a lot of the reasons why the federal government is now building a pipeline and why they're deeply flawed. So, in case you haven't heard, Canada is going to pay for another pipeline, even if the PM would rather call it an investment. As heat waves, wildfires, and flooding endanger Canadian lives and even disrupt Canada today, Canadians are united in wanting climate action and not wanting a publicly funded pipeline. Polls show this consistently, including in Alberta. But the Prime Minister instead announced Canada will not meet climate targets and will purposefully enable further oil and gas expansion, as Rachel Gilmore reported on the day before Canada Day. And now it's just been announced that we're building a pipeline that both the Canadian and Albertan governments will invest in, and that will be constructed by the Trans Mountain Corporation, a federal crown corporation. 61% of Albertans oppose subsidies for a new pipeline, according to Probe Research. And two-thirds say the province's economy is too dependent on oil and gas. Meanwhile, according to Abacus data, 69% of people across Canada and 62% in Alberta support government regulations to limit oil and gas companies' greenhouse gas emissions. Albertans and other Canadians alike also wanted stronger industrial carbon pricing. There are multiple polls that show this from different polling firms, including showing that Albertans are against subsidies for this pipeline. Again, multiple different polls. Cuts to climate policy and the construction of a new pipeline are not necessary for national unity, and these actions only enable a small group of oil, gas, and tech interests with, shall we say, some alignment with south of the border, who want to keep pushing for more division and leverage, and have just learned that pushing for division and leverage works. The private industry partner on the pipeline project, and I say private industry partner for a reason, Pembina Pipeline Corporation, appears to be really more of a cover for a publicly built pipeline. As CBC reports, quote, the private sector Pembina company said that it shall have no at-risk development capital at this stage, which likely means that for the moment, it is not risking a substantial amount of money, if any. And since CBC reported that, it's looking like at most the private company will cover just 10% if they decided to. That leaves 90% for us to cover. As Jimmy Thompson pointed out on Blue Sky, quote, the new pipeline is expected to cost between 35 to 44 billion of mostly public money, according to the Alberta filing. There are three things to know here. Number one, there might be a private partner, but for a pipeline like this to even be built, it would still need massive public financing, and that will be a loss to the Canadian public. Number two, it's very likely any private sector partners will realize this pipeline doesn't make sense at some point. You can bet that story ends with the public picking up their part of the bill as well. As the IEEFA notes, the chances for recouping public funds that have been sunken into the previous TMX are slim. Number three, carbon capture and storage projects, such as the Pathways project connected to the pipeline, do not work for reducing emissions and are themselves a way for government to subsidize oil and gas, representing more public investment. Now, that may complicate things just a little bit by quoting the Pembina Institute, which is not the Pembina Pipeline Corporation, but rather a clean energy think tank. Sorry for the confusion. The Pembina Institute points out, to quote, Alberta and Ottawa said any new pipeline would be privately funded. Today, that was yesterday, that promise was broken. A private company will cover just 10%. Taxpayers will front up tens of billions of dollars. And note that, quote, there is nothing in today's MOU announcement between Canada, Alberta, and the Pathways companies that actually compels the companies to move forward on this project. So as far as pathways and carbon capture and storage, if you hear the Prime Minister saying that it's going to reduce the emissions of a pipeline, there is nothing to actually compel those companies to even build carbon capture and storage, even if carbon capture and storage actually worked. So, one thing we do know for certain is that oil and gas expansion is not economically profitable. There was not enough future demand for oil and gas to justify a new pipeline, nor new LNG projects before the Iran war. The war has convinced countries to go renewable even faster, destroying even more demand for LNG and gas and oil. No amount of trust will overcome that. So if a new oil pipeline requires public financing, then that means the public will pay the price for the pipeline and there won't be any reward, just a bill to pay. Remember how Trans Mountain was going to be sold to a private entity? As the Energy Mix reported recently, quote, cabinet ministers and officials originally insisted they did not intend for the public to be the long-term owner, but now Trans Mountain Corporation and its financial overseer are making a pitch to keep the controversial $34 billion pipeline in the government hands indefinitely. The T also reported that Trans Mountain's profitability could be an accounting illusion. Again, oil and gas interests will do everything they can to undermine climate policy, which is why false pragmatism that lowers climate targets only ensures we achieve nothing at all. It's a bit like aiming a cannon at a target by aiming it straight at a target, or even lower than it, and not accounting for gravity or wind resistance. You need to aim higher to reach the target. Otherwise, you're just aiming lower and yelling, I'm practical for some reason. As far as equity partnerships with First Nations, as well as financing via the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, one need only look to LNG and the risks that has brought to communities to look at the risks that a new pipeline in that regard would take to those communities. As DSMOG reports, as Mark Carney fast tracks Canadian LNG projects, First Nations face hidden financial traps. Critics say new LNG ventures in British Columbia saddle Indigenous communities with debt, opaque ownership structures, and financial risk that could leave them owing billions. A southern route for the pipeline does not magically make its hurdles nor its climate impact go away, as the Energy Mix reported recently. Quote, four southern First Nations remain opposed to TMX, and there's no sign they would support a pipeline expansion, and a route to Delta would engage a different set of nations. The International Energy Agency still projects declining demand for oil and gas with no new production needed, as Catherine Abreu explained at the IEA Energy Efficiency Conference in Montreal this week. And this is the Prime Minister's pipeline. The Prime Minister must really get credit for this pipeline proposal alongside Alberta. After all, he has made sure we will all invest in it. The federal government has taken actions that have sought to enable this pipeline at every step, and threatening BC if BC didn't cooperate was undoubtedly vital to getting to this point. We know it's a genuine love of pipelines that fueled these decisions. After all, the federal government's AI strategy is purposely meant to burn more gas, as DSMOG revealed recently. That's along with all the other environmental deregulation that we are seeing that breaks the national unity narrative, like the deregulation of pesticides that actually hurts our ability to implement trade diversification. That doesn't fit into the national unity cover story because it's just a cover story. Again, I highly recommend reading a three-part series in the T on the influence of the pro-oil, pro-LNG, and pro-AI group Build Canada on federal policy to understand this more. It's a group whose founders did not want Canada to retaliate when there was aggression from south of the border, and who cherish Musk. That's the problem with not being able to hear the word no, a word the PM does not want to hear. It makes one very likely to fall for scams. 4D chess is a lie. This idea that the Prime Minister was playing some 4D chess game to secretly stop a pipeline while making it look like he was doing one. And many of us might even have told ourselves that lie at some point, but it's not too late to untell yourself. It just means that you realize that the pipeline was a bad idea, even if the Prime Minister doesn't get that. So, that's a very smart thing to realize. It's just the PM didn't realize that. And it's a massive lie. It's a lie that could cost Canadians tens of billions of dollars. It also begs the question of what other lies about the direction of policy are out there that we may believe. Because I have to say, what was most disturbing is that the Prime Minister twice recently referenced the abnormal weather and heat we are having right now, noting the biblical weather in Ottawa, even as he announced the pipeline plan. Without a trace of irony, he said these things, as Gilmore pointed out, nor without any realization that what was causing that extreme heat is linked to using fossil fuels, and a pipeline will make that worse. People in France are dying because of this. Mortuaries are having trouble finding space. The World Weather Attribution Organization, that quantifies how climate change influences the intensity and likelihood of extreme weather events, has a release out today about the heat we are experiencing in Canada, and to quote, scientists find a humid heat impacting the World Cup and national celebrations in Canada would have been virtually impossible without climate change. In a climate that is 1.4 degrees centigrade cooler than it was before human-caused climate change, the WBGT levels forecast would have been so rare that it would have been virtually impossible, at most, not expected to occur even once in many thousands of years. Even in today's climate, it remains relatively rare, expected about 1 in every 200 years as a best estimate, though there is high uncertainty in this given the extremity of the event. The researchers found no role for El Nino in driving these temperatures. I wrote most of this episode of this podcast in my apartment during a heat wave with the AC on blast, which I normally try to avoid using. But even with it on, it was hot and hard to focus. And I can only imagine how bad it is right now for people who are at risk from extreme heat or can't afford cooling technology right now. The cost of not acting on climate change is going to be severe. It does not outweigh the cost of acting on it. So what truly disturbs me are the statements by the PM that try to throw this situation off as if it's worthy only of a witty comment about the biblical impacts of weather in Ottawa, or can be fixed merely by a water break. If you're still listening to this, then I imagine you feel somewhat the way I do and would like to do something about it. If you want, take action by spreading the word and talking with others. There's a guide about how to effectively talk with others at the link in the description. Call your MP and oppose this pipeline. Share this podcast or share our social media posts about this issue. Find sources for all of this information I've just talked about, and the actions you can take at the link in the description for the newsletter. And sign up to our newsletter for more updates like this. Anyway, here's the interview with Markham. And, Markham and I don't agree on everything, but we had a really great chat about some of the actual solutions to problems we're facing in Canada and why the federal government isn't even examining them or looking at them, and why instead they seem so focused on an oil pipeline that still doesn't have an economic case and that we're sinking billions of dollars into now. Anyway, as I say, it's from April, so it's a little bit older. It's before all these recent announcements happened, so keep that in context. But do be sure to go check out Energi Media, that's Energy with an I, on YouTube as well. I'll link to it in the description. They have lots of videos that come out pretty regularly on energy subjects, and it's a really interesting place to hear a different perspective on all of this. For those tuning in, who are you and what do you do?
Well, Markham Hislop, and I'm an energy journalist and the CEO of Energi Media. That's Energi, and essentially, we're in our 18th year. We're one of those overnight successes, 18 years in the making, because our form of energy journalism, which is to interview experts. So we're talking about economists and engineers and mostly technical people, and we do it. Half of our roughly 500 interviews a year are in outside of Canada, and then half are inside Canada. And since we're interviewing about the energy transition primarily, the idea is to bring the lessons that we've learned with our international work into the Canadian context and say, how does this apply? So, for instance, if you sitting in Canada, you probably think the energy transition really isn't much of a thing, and oil and gas and still rule, and that's going to be basically the future of economies for decades to come. Get into Europe, different perspective entirely. Get into China, and now you're in the first electrostate. And the changes that are coming in their transportation sector, which is electrifying, in their power sector, which is they're building out solar and wind and batteries at an amazing rate. Never mind hydro and nuclear, which they're adding to it. They're electrifying their economy. They're already now, we're at about 20% electrification. They're at 30% and rising, about 1 to 2% a year. So by the time 2050 comes along, where are they going to be? 60, 70, 80% electrified? And this is one of the reasons, and it's not just China. What China has done is, starting about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it identified new energy technologies, so electric vehicles, batteries, as a core strategic and economic advantage, a geopolitical advantage. And it poured enormous, and I mean enormous sums into building out those industries. So you're not only developing the technology, but you're also scaling up the manufacture. They have the capacity to manufacture 50 million automobiles. 50 million. And we know, they because they've told us in very clear terms, their goal is to kill the internal combustion engine and to dominate international auto manufacturing with electric vehicles. That's the goal, and they're well on their way to do it. They made 34 million electric vehicles last year. I think the internal market, they had bought 17 million, something like that. It was like a 52% of all the vehicles sold in China were electric. So you can take that model in transportation and then apply it to buildings, because
Mhm.
now they're adopting heat pumps at scale. And you can take it and apply it to industry, because now they're using industrial heat and they're using industrial processes that are electric. So they've got this massive build out of their power sector, massive scale up of electrotech manufacturing, massive adoption in their consumer economy, industrial economy, commercial economy. And what they've done by doing it at home is they've driven down the costs and increased their manufacturing capacity so they could serve export markets.
Yeah.
And so, in May of 2024, when then President Joe Biden said, no, we're putting 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, and then Canada did it in September. And I said at the time, I said, all they're going to do is China's just going to pivot to the global south and say, so long, we don't need you. And it's exactly what they've done. And so you see them not only exporting more and more and more EVs and other electrotech out into places like Brazil, into Bangladesh and Pakistan, and so on, but they're also building plants. So, BYD is building a plant in Brazil, and there's Hungary and Turkey and other places in Europe, because Europe has got tariffs, but they're much more friendly to Chinese EVs, on and on. This is an industrial strategy tied to geopolitical strategy.
Right.
And we here in North America, we're in Fortress North America, right? So we're dominated. We're both Canada and the U.S. The U.S. is the number one natural gas LNG exporter and oil exporter, and Canada is number four. And I think in gas we're number five. So we are essentially petrostates. That's a lot of people in Alberta bridle at that, but the truth is we are. And so we see what's going on internationally in the global energy system through the lens of a petrostate. And we are the incumbent. Our markets have been disrupted by new technologies, these electric technologies, and in classic incumbent style, we deny it. We minimize it. We pretend that it's not happening. And we double down. Incumbents always double down on the status quo at a time of disruption. You can go, we are the blockbuster to China's Netflix.
It's as if we're back in the Cold War and the space race, and like as if America decided, okay, so the Soviets have just built, rockets capable of reaching orbit, and we are going to build biplanes. Like that's how this feels to me at this point, because like, well, fair enough. I can understand people being concerned about growing Chinese influence overseas, but if you want to compete with that, to my mind, the thought is you have to figure out how you're going to have some share of that market, how you're going to actually be, or at the very least, have the supply chains internally to your own nation for renewables, that you're not then relying upon China for that. You're able to produce some of these things in-house.
Have you ever noticed that when the discussion around pipelines, so we're talking oil,
Yeah.
and LNG, so we're talking natural gas, that nobody ever in Canada ever talks about customers? They
No.
always talk about how, oh, we have really cheap gas, which we do. We have really cheap, heavy, sour crude oil, which we do. And it's dependable, and it's not doesn't suffer from geopolitical disruptions in the same way that we're seeing it with the Strait of Hormuz and the war on Iran. But we always talk about, and I just critiqued an economist study a couple days ago on this very topic. They say if we build a pipeline, there will be all of these economic benefits, $31 billion a year for the West Coast pipeline that Alberta wants to build. And my question was, oh, and who are you going to sell it to?
Hmm.
Do you know? And what price are you going to sell it at? And do you have competitors? Well, because right now it costs you $16 to get a barrel to a Chinese refinery, and it costs the Saudis $2, and it costs the Iraqis $2, and it costs Venezuela $5. And how are you going to compete against that? And not only that, but we have Chinese, the Chinese, they're not stupid people. I mean, they've been doing this modeling themselves, and you can find it from Sinopec, the state-owned refiner, and you can sell the CNPC, the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation, state-owned, the Peking University, and they do these demand studies, and they say, oh well, you know what? By 2050, we're now consuming 17.4 million barrels a day of oil, and it'll be anywhere from 5.5 million to 7.5 million by 2050. We're going to lose 10 to 12 million barrels a day of consumption.
Yeah.
And by the 2050, the transportation sector will all be electrified, and the only demand will be, well, there'll be some for aircraft, for aviation, and for marine shipping, and then the rest will go into petrochemicals, and that's it. So here we are talking about building a pipeline to a market which the market itself says, no, we don't want your stuff.
Sure.
They say, when you go over there, they say, oh yeah, right now we could use, 200,000 barrels a day for this petrochemical plant because, there's the international heavy market is tight. But that doesn't mean if you're going to build a 50-year piece of infrastructure, which the taxpayer will inevitably help fund, what they need today is not adequate. You need to know or have a pretty good guess that they're going to need that same amount of oil in 25 years and that you can provide it competitively. And nobody ever asked that question. Not the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, not his Energy Minister, Tim Hodgson, not Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, and not any of the oil CEOs. They assume it to be true. And assuming is not good enough when taxpayers' dollars are on the line.
Well, okay, so I'm curious to shift out east because that's the West Coast pipeline, but like I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador myself, right? So again, I when you talk about being in an echo chamber of oil and gas and not hearing from outside sources that are saying, hold on a second, maybe just some caution here. Check what your market is. Check if people are actually going to need this in the time it takes to build these projects. We're just going through this thing with the Bay du Nord oil project that's being proposed, right? Now, its first oil, ideally, optimistically, is 2031, right? Optimistically. A good study came out recently showing Equinor's projects, BP's projects, a lot of these projects are happening like way longer in the future than they're planned. And you had somebody on the show, your show the other day, talking about potential peak oil because of the Iran crisis, because of everybody going, well, oil's unreliable, let's get off of it. Potential peak oil prior to 2029. I mean, how does that impact something like offshore oil, and what's the difference there between, say, that and a West Coast oil pipeline?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was Dan Walter from Energi that I was interviewing. And
Yeah.
when you listen to the Prime Minister or Hodgson or Smith, or BC Energy Minister Adrian Dix, for that matter, they're very bullish on oil and gas future, right?
Yeah.
But there's a reason for that. It's rooted in analysis, bad analysis, but nevertheless, it's rooted in analysis. So there are three basic views of where oil and gas are in the future. So you've got on the high end, you've got OPEC, and you've got now the IEA CTS scenario. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so you're going to see oil demand grow from 103 million barrels a day to 120, 125. That's the high end. Then you've got the IEA's STEP scenario, which is basically a status quo. It goes from 103 to maybe like 98 million barrels a day by 2050. Then you have the announced policy scenario, the APS scenario, which the IEA has been under a lot of pressure from the Trump government to abandon, because under that scenario, oil peaks in 2030, and then by 2050, it declines by almost 50%. And I don't know how Canada competes in a market where you lose half of the supply, right? So prices, demand obviously goes down. You've got more suppliers competing prices. So oil prices are going to collapse, yada, yada, yada. I mean, this is it's a very simple, economics 101 is what that is. So the problem here is I sent a media request to both the Tim Hodgson's Department of Natural Resources, NRCan, and I sent one to Adrian Dix's Ministry of Energy in BC, and I said, Your minister is very bullish on the future prospects for oil and gas. What are the modeling studies that underpin his public comments?
Yeah.
And they were very forthcoming. They came back and said it's OPEC, which is, as you can imagine, ultra supportive of high consumption.
Yeah.
ExxonMobil, Shell, the IEA steps. There's an institute in Japan that's very conservative on this. The U.S. Energy Information Administration, which is very conservative as a rule. It had none of the IEA APS. It had none of Rystad or Ember or even S&P Global. I mean, it had all of the high-end scenarios and very few of the middle, and none at the on the low end. So a few in the base case, none on the low end. Well, as I just mentioned earlier, the low end IEA APS scenario. I mentioned it, but I didn't tell you the background to this. So we have an energy transition theory of change here at Energy Media, and I read a lot of energy demand studies, and I'm not a math guy, right? I would probably fail grade 6 math if you put me to the test. But modeling is not just about the mathematical model, it's the assumptions that go into it.
Of
And
course.
I can check assumptions.
Yeah.
So what we did is we went and got the major assumptions behind the OPEC model, the STEPS model, and the APS scenarios is what they are.
Yeah.
And then we compared the assumptions to the trends that we can observe, the data that we can observe. And we said, which scenario best matches or is closest to the data that we're seeing? And it was the APS scenario, hands down.
Really.
It's not the high scenario. It's not even the base scenario. It's the low scenario. And so what that tells me is that our provincial energy ministers, and we all know where Alberta sits on this issue, very pro oil and gas. So even in BC and even at the national level, the Mark Carney government is guided by and advised by these high demand scenarios out to 2050. That's why they're so bullish,
Because they're only
because
listening to one side, and it's not even the side of those scenarios that matches with the current evidence that you're actually seeing. If you look at the
correct.
current evidence, the trends are more towards those lower end scenarios like APS, which, I mean, like, to be honest, like, and this is where, it's always weird. There's this dissonance for me, right? Because on the one hand, I care very much about climate. I do not really want to see oil and gas expansion. On the other hand, I know that the province I'm from, big part of the economy relies upon that industry. So what I want to see is we know that industry is not going anywhere. How do we get to something else, right? How do we build up the renewable options or even alternative industries? It doesn't necessarily only need to be renewables, but alternative industries, there are existing industries like fishery tourism in the province that could do with more support. So how do we offset that fallout? Because that's what really scares me. And I think it came up in that interview with Ember Energy. High oil prices now, everybody gets it in their head. Yeah, high oil prices, there'll be demand way out into the future. And then in a few years' time, right around the time a lot of these projects could theoretically, best case scenario, come online, those oil prices collapse, the demand collapses, and you've spent a bunch of, I mean, I've already seen this. About the same time that there's the Bay du Nord announcement in Newfoundland and Labrador, there's the Pan-Canadian Electricity Corridor announcement that came out. Notable exception to that was NL. They weren't part of that announcement. And there are people saying, you see this online, so how present this is, but you see people saying, oh no, we don't need that. We've got oil and gas. And that scares me because that says you're making a bet on something based on all these scenarios and you're ignoring other options. Um, yeah, I don't know. Like,
Well,
should we at least have
okay,
a
so
backup
here's
plan?
we don't have a backup plan, and that's the problem. And I would say I qualify that by saying that I've actually done a thorough um, analysis, I will call it, of Mark Carney's economic strategy. And you can see it on our thoughtful energy journalism Substack. I did it, published it about 2, 3 weeks ago. And I said, I put structure around it. I said, here are the 4 pillars or 5 pillars of the strategy. And then here are all the, sort of the sub plans or the plans within each one of the pillars. Here's how they all fit together, on and on and on. And which the prime minister hasn't even done that. The prime minister can't even explain his own economic strategy.
Yeah, that's the
Right? So
problem.
we had to go and do it. We had to go do it for him. But here, I want to get back to the modeling issue for a moment, because this is a real bugaboo of mine. I don't know how many energy economists we've got in Canada, but it's a lot.
Yeah.
A bunch of them in Alberta, and there's enough of them in BC and Ottawa, in Ontario. That the work that a journalist had to do to go and identify all the assumptions of the 3 scenarios, then compare them to the data and the trends. That we should have economists doing that kind of work. I mean,
Yeah.
because if you go down even into the U.S., but boy, you sure see it in Europe, where you got places like the IEA is based in Paris, and you've got the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies in Cambridge, and you've got on and on and on. I mean, there are just lots of academics and researchers working on these kinds of issues. And in Canada, you got nada. Like, we're being let down by the people who should be doing this work and holding the government to account with their academic research.
Yeah.
And we're not. I mean, invariably, our energy economists are all about how does the status quo work. And we debate about how many angels dance on the head of the carbon pricing pin. We're so inward looking, and we don't ever stop and say, hang on a second, Canada's part of this bigger economy, this global economy and global energy system, and how all of the stuff that we do. And the fact that other countries are doing it, I think, helps a lot to focus and structure the conversation that they're having. They have a more fulsome discussion of the energy future than Canadians do.
Yeah.
Canadians, when you look at our media, all we ever do is debate about what was said about pipelines.
That's it.
Or
Yeah.
what
No,
was
it's
said
true.
about LNG.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
very seldom talk about electricity, and the only time we do is when the prime minister comes out and says, "Oh, here I've got a strategy. We're going to build a national power grid." Oh, that's nice. Here's what the prime minister said, and then they go away, and nobody ever does any further reporting on that to identify the fact that this has been around for decades, and why hasn't it advanced, and what are some of the technical issues, what are some of the benefits, and yada yada. I mean, it's a whole huge conversation that we need to have all by itself, is how we build a national power grid and how we double or triple the amount of electricity that because that's what we're going to need in 2050. How are we going to get there, and what's our supply going to look like, and how do we have to modernize our grid? We don't ever have those conversations. The Americans do, because they're in a crisis. I mean, their power grid is in big trouble. It's creaky and old. And now all of a sudden, thanks to data centers, they need like 5% more electricity a year, and they just can't get it. They're pulling their hair out, wondering how they're going to keep the lights on.
Well,
Okay, so
breaking
sorry.
news just before we came on, I'm reading that Hodgson is in talks to sell LNG to the US for data centers. That's something that just came out before our chat here. I don't know if you've seen that yet, but as far as I could tell, it literally came out like last hour or something like that.
Can I swear on your podcast? And I'll tell you why. Because Tim Hodgson, I did a video last fall, and it was about Mark Carney. And I said, hey, it was called Bait and Switch, I voted for Values Carney, and I got Goldman Sachs Carney.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, the prime minister set himself up for this, because I believe that the values Carney, we're talking about his book here, of course, his 2021 book, where he talked about, a whole bunch of that, global capitalism has to be infused with values for, that work for people, not just capital and investors. We agree with all that stuff. But the problem is, once Donald Trump threatened to basically annex Canada and beat us into submission with tariffs and economic warfare, Carney's response was, we're going to no longer integrate with you, and we're going to look for new customers in Asia and Europe for our products, and then we're going to build the infrastructure we need to get those products out to those new customers, and we're also going to expand our natural resource extraction while we're doing it. Right.
Mm,
So that's basically the strategy. And as soon as those words came out of his mouth, I went, oh,
mm,
because the who's going to lead that process? It will be the incumbent companies. It'll be the mining companies. It'll be the oil companies and the gas companies and the pipeline companies. And it'll be those who have, shovels in the ground and can get a project of national interest up and running in short order. So the whole strategy was based on the companies who are already in the market and have projects that are ready to go and have access to the capital to make it all happen as quickly as possible. And we had there's almost no way out of that now. We're stuck. We're on that track. And so that's what we talk about. We don't talk about, hey, you know what? They're actually in Alberta. There's a provincial agency called Alberta Innovates. They've developed a process that will take oil sands bitumen and turn it into carbon fiber.
mm.
A non-combustion use. You turn bitumen into feedstock for advanced materials manufacturing. So it could be carbon fiber, it could be graphite, it could be asphalt binder, it could be a whole, but you're not sending it to a refinery to turn it into a fuel, which then gets combusted in a car or a plane or marine transport or whatever it is. There's lots of options here. We don't have to do the same thing we've been doing for decades. We don't have to be, the hewers of wood and drawers of water and the hinterland to the American metropolis or the European metropolis or the Chinese metropolis. We can add value. We can move laterally into other industries and add more, up the value chain on our natural resource. That should be the conversation. Now, I have a mole, as journalists are wont to do, in NRCan,
Mm.
and they tell me that inside the department, those conversations are verboten.
You don't discuss
The
this.
government, the government is committed to oil and LNG and pipelines.
Yep.
And you best not, if you want keep your job and keep your career on track, you best not contradict what the minister wants. And I want to circle back to this, the values Carney versus Goldman Sachs Carney. Tim Hodgson is a former Goldman Sachs banker. He
Hmm.
worked with Carney at Goldman Sachs. When Carney went over from Goldman Sachs to the Bank of Canada, he followed him as his deputy. And then his Hodgson's reputation is he's a deal bulldog. He's a deal maker, man. I mean, if you want to get a deal for a pipeline or whatever it is, he puts it together, he gets the capital, he'll make it happen. And it's no secret, to me anyway, why Carney chose him as the Minister for Natural Resources. It's to do deals. It's to get all of these big projects that are going into the major projects office and to get them funded and to get them up and running as quickly as possible and bring them across the finish line. That's Tim Hodgson's job.
So,
So
like
it's
this.
not, well, I just want to finish this.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah. Go
not
ahead.
Tim Hodgson's job to be thoughtful. It's
Right.
not Tim Hodgson's job to think about the energy transition and where the global energy system is going and how demand is changing in Asia and how it's
Yeah.
probably going to change pretty quick. That's not his job. He's a deal maker and he's got his blinkers on, and that's all he's doing. So it falls to people like, it falls to Energy Media and a few others to basically try to educate the Canadians about it and build a political constituency for change.
Well, and so this is something that, like, just let's talk strategy here for a second, because I don't think of values as unstrategic things. Like, they're strategic assets in what you do. I mean, the US, if you really look at what's happened there with the sort of consolidation of power underneath a government that's increasingly authoritarian, a lot of that is down to the erosion of any values, and a lot of the same problems are present in Canada, right? Like if we don't have some sort of way, we can't win against the US by becoming them, right? Like it's not that kind of conflict. It's not World War II where, oh, you build up industrial capacity and then you're safe, right? That's just not the way these things work. They're communications battles as much as anything else. And as you point out, it's like, okay, yeah, you can get the best deal maker on the planet doing deals and trying to get projects, but if they're the wrong projects that don't meet the needs of the time that they're going to come online, that's not strategy. That's not strategy. That's not strategic. That's not practical. That's not pragmatic. I don't consider that to be like smart thinking. I consider that to just be like, I'm scared and I don't know what to do, so let's do this random thing. I don't know. Yeah, anyway, your take on that.
Here's my take on that. And the take is that they're doing what they've always done, and they're doing what industry is telling them can be done. And industry says we will invest, but the government has put itself at a strategic disadvantage in negotiating with industry
Hmm.
because now industry knows the government is desperate to get this done. And so industry is saying, well, you know what? You have these 9 regulations like C-69 and C-48 and the oil and gas emissions cap and yada yada. There's a whole bunch of them. We need them gone. Oh, okay. Well, here's 7 of them of the 9. Poof, we vaporize them, and how's that? Oh no, that's not enough. And Sonia Savage, former Alberta Minister of Energy, was on a CBC podcast about a month and a half ago, and she was saying that, well, because she's a former pipeline lobbyist, that's why I bring her up, and she said, oh well, you know what? Based on what went on with Trans Mountain expansion, which cost the Canadian taxpayer $35 billion, industry doesn't really like that. We don't think that it's commercially viable, and so we're going to need public backstopping for a new pipeline.
Yeah.
And already the federal government is paying. It has an investment tax credit worth 50% of the capital cost of carbon capture storage for the oil sands, which are estimated by the oil sands to cost 50 billion. So we've got like 25 billion probably committed, and more if there needs to be expansion to fill the pipeline.
Yeah.
You can see where I'm going with this is that our government is so desperate to push to pivot away from Trump in the United States that we're going to put taxpayer dollars into very suspect projects that haven't had a due diligence, haven't demonstrated a business case, haven't done the basic frickin' math and the
Hmm.
homework to understand the markets they say they want to serve. They're basically, taking the industry in Alberta at its word, and that's where we're going to go, and we're going to bend over backwards to get industry to the table and get these projects built. That's a really, really bad strategy.
Yeah.
That's a really bad strategy. And the problem here is that nobody's got a better one. Well, I mean, we've advanced a better one, but I mean,
Yeah,
we're a
sure.
small media outlet, right? But
Well,
where is the
and also, I wonder if this ties into it, right? Like, I think there's this stereotype that probably, I hate to say it, it probably exists at the upper levels of Canadian government of, oh, the climate activists, they wouldn't know how to do any of this stuff. We must. But here's the irony with that, right? Like, when I look at where was all the 51st state rhetoric coming from, still coming from? Where is all the climate denial coming from? Where's all the pro oil and gas stuff coming from? Often that source is the same three things. So you're trying to benefit an industry that is very clearly interested in alignment with the United States government. They like them. They are interested in exporting more oil and gas. The only place they actually really want to export more, as far as I can tell, is the United States, that they genuinely want to export more interconnection with the US for Canada. Um, and yet, despite all of that, they are the trustworthy source for government to go to. And, like I'm not going to back everything every environmentalist has ever said. I can't go do that either. But like, it feels like, the people who naturally could come in and say, hey, we just have a different idea. We don't even get in the door to say, hi, there's another path here. Yeah, sorry.
I'll give you an example. So there's a company called Northern Nations Cooperative. It's based out of BC, but it's the technology they have is to take raw bitumen, so not diluted bitumen that you would put into a pipeline, raw bitumen, pack it cold into a modified sea can with a plastic bladder around it. And then you ship it off to Europe or Asia, and you sell it at, two, three, four times what you'd get if you were selling it into a refinery. And they have the technology, they've got the supply lined up in Alberta, they've got the capital to build the facilities. So they tell me the technology, this ain't rocket science. It's not like turning bitumen into carbon fiber. It's fairly simple. And they cannot get consideration as a project of national interest because nobody wants to talk about anything other than pipelines and LNG.
And that's not even
Oil.
renewable energy. We're not even talking about like the stuff that we
Yep.
would support, right? Renewable
Yep.
energy. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're not a big fan of like, we tend to want to move to a circular economy. There might be other uses for some things, right? Like not totally open to discussing that. But even getting to the stage where we're talking about wind and solar power and batteries and all these solutions that we really advocate for, let alone that they're not even interested in other uses for the bitumen. That's how.
Higher value uses. Because Alberta Innovates has done the math, and they say that if you sell a barrel of bitumen down to an American refinery, and if you're getting $50 for that barrel, if you did asphalt binder, you would get $100 to $125 for that barrel. So they're
Mhm.
actually leaving money on the table
They're
by
not
doing that.
even, yeah.
So this is the power of incumbents. Incumbents are gatekeepers, and the incumbents love the status quo. They've got all the capital, they've got all their expertise, all of their company organized to maximize the benefits, the value from the status quo.
Yeah.
And until that status quo is so disrupted that they can't continue doing that, that's what they're going to support. And so what we have in Ottawa now is a prime minister and an energy minister who are bought into the status quo,
Mhm.
and they support the incumbents. Connor, I have to run actually. I have to get off to another interview and do what I do.
Thank you very much for joining me. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. And hey, just go talk with others. Honestly, share this podcast, spread the word. That's one of the most effective things that you can do. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.